May 12, 1942. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, Dry Dock Number 1, 13:47 hours. The acetylene torch hissed its final cut through reinforced steel, throwing a cascade of white-hot sparks across the oil-stained water 30 feet below. Chief Carpenter Boyd Mackenzie pulled off his welding mask, the kind that left red pressure marks around your eyes that lasted for hours, and stepped back from the hull patch. 72 hours ago, he'd been told it couldn't be done. 72 hours ago, Admiral Chester Nimitz himself had stood on this dock, hands clasped behind his back in that way senior officers do when they're about to deliver bad news, and stared at the gaping wound in Yorktown's starboard side. 4 decks shredded, structural frames twisted like ribbon candy, fuel lines severed. A Japanese 250-kilogram bomb, 550 pounds of high explosive, had penetrated deep into the carrier's guts before detonating in the aviation store's compartment, and the blast had done what blast waves do. Found every weakness, exploited every seam, turned solid metal into something that looked like it had been chewed. The Navy Yard inspectors said 2 weeks minimum, maybe 3 if the structural damage was worse than it looked. But Nimitz looked at the twisted steel, looked at the calendar, and gave a different order. Admiral Fletcher needs this ship in 3 days. Mackenzie, who'd learned his trade in the Brooklyn Navy Yard before the war and knew that regulations existed until they became obstacles, wiped his sweat and metal dust from his face with a rag that was already black with both. "We did it in 3 days, Admiral," he muttered to no one in particular, because Nimitz wasn't there to hear it, and Mackenzie's crew was too exhausted to care. What Nimitz couldn't have known, because no one in the United States Navy had ever attempted a repair of this magnitude in this time frame, was that the men working on Yorktown had already made a choice. Sleep later, mourn later, rest when the Japanese are beaten. And what the Japanese High Command celebrating Yorktown's sinking 2,000 miles to the south certainly didn't know was that this carrier had already learned the most important lesson of the Pacific War: how to die and come back. She would do it again in 23 days.
To understand why everyone believed Yorktown was finished, you need to understand what happened on May 7th, 1942, in the Coral Sea, 1,000 miles northeast of Australia, in waters so blue they hurt your eyes. The Battle of Coral Sea was the first naval engagement in history where the opposing ships never saw each other. Everything happened by aircraft, scouts finding targets, dive bombers and torpedo planes doing the killing, fighters trying to stop them. It was warfare at a distance, and distance created uncertainty. Uncertainty created mistakes. At 1100 hours on May 7th, Yorktown's radar, a new technology that most commanders didn't fully trust yet, picked up incoming Japanese aircraft. 18 Aichi D-3A Vol dive bombers, escorted by fighters. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, Yorktown's commanding officer, a 1912 Naval Academy graduate who'd spent 30 years preparing for a moment like this, immediately ordered the ship to general quarters. The klaxon sounded, men ran. Yorktown's fighter squadron, VF-42, flying Grumman F-4F Wildcats, scrambled to intercept. They shot down several attackers, but several wasn't enough. One Vol, flown by a pilot whose name we'll never know, penetrated the defensive screen, rolled into a 70-degree dive and released at 2,500 feet, close enough that anti-aircraft gunners could see the bomb leave the aircraft. The bomb hit Yorktown's flight deck with the sound that every sailor in the Pacific learned to dread. Not an explosion, but a penetrating crack. The sound of something punching through where it shouldn't be able to punch through. It penetrated the flight deck, penetrated the gallery deck, penetrated the hangar deck, penetrated the second deck, detonated in the rag storage compartment, a space filled with oil-soaked cleaning materials, paint, aviation fuel residue, everything that burns. 66 men died immediately or were wounded so severely they wouldn't survive the day. The blast ruptured fuel lines, disabled 3 boilers, killed power to 2/3 of the ship. Yorktown developed a 5-degree list to starboard, not catastrophic but noticeable. The kind of list that makes coffee cups slide off tables and tells everyone aboard that their ship is hurt. Japanese pilots climbing a way through anti-aircraft fire reported Yorktown sinking. They were wrong, but it was an understandable mistake. Carriers didn't survive that kind of internal damage. The conventional wisdom, written in blood across the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the Java Sea, said that a carrier with multiple deck penetrations and major fires was a carrier preparing to die. Yorktown's damage control teams, led by Commander Clarence A. Aldridge, thought differently. They fought the fires, isolated the damaged sections, rerouted power, restored propulsion. Within 90 minutes, Yorktown was making 25 knots and recovering aircraft. But the damage was real. The structural compromises were serious. And when Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 10th, every expert who examined her reached the same conclusion. 2 weeks minimum in dry dock, maybe 3. The problem was time. Admiral Nimitz didn't have 3 weeks.
What the repair estimates didn't account for, what couldn't account for because it had never been tested, was what happens when you tell American shipyard workers that the Pacific War might be lost if they can't do the impossible. Commander Aldrich, who'd kept Yorktown alive in the Coral Sea, now faced a different challenge: convince 1,400 shipyard workers to work around the clock without breaks, without shift changes, without stopping for anything except the absolute physical limits of human endurance. He didn't have to convince them. They volunteered. Electricians, welders, machinists, pipe fitters, carpenters, men in their 20s to men in their 60s, some who built Yorktown 5 years earlier and knew every frame and stringer in her hull. They brought their tools and their lunch pails and their thermoses of coffee, and they didn't leave. The work was brutal. Welding in confined spaces where temperatures reached 120 degrees, hammering out twisted frames, rerouting electrical systems, replacing entire sections of hull plating. The sparks from cutting torches created a constant rain of white-hot metal. The noise was overwhelming. Metal on metal, pneumatic hammers, ventilation fans trying desperately to clear smoke from below-deck spaces. Boyd Mackenzie, leading the structural repair team, worked a particular nightmare. The bomb had twisted a primary frame member, part of Yorktown's skeleton, into a pretzel shape. Navy regulations said you couldn't straighten it. You had to cut it out and replace it. But cutting it out meant cutting through 6 other supporting members, and replacing it meant fabricating a custom piece from scratch. It would take a week, minimum. Mackenzie looked at the twisted metal, looked at his crew, and made a decision that would have horrified a structural engineer. We're not replacing it. We're covering it. They welded massive steel plates over the damaged sections, plates thick enough to restore structural integrity without the time-consuming work of cutting and replacing. They reinforced critical points with wooden shoring, using timber cut to precise lengths and wedged into place under compression. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't by the book. It held. Lieutenant Commander John F. Delaney, Yorktown's chief engineer, supervised the propulsion repairs. 3 boilers were damaged. Superheater tubes were cracked. Steam lines were compromised. Under normal circumstances, that phrase that had ceased to have meaning, each boiler would be disassembled, inspected, and rebuilt. Time required? 5 days per boiler. Delaney's team bypassed the damaged sections, rerouted steam, and accepted reduced efficiency in exchange for operational capacity. Yorktown wouldn't make her full 32 knots. She'd make 27. That would have to be enough. On the flight deck, repair crews replaced buckled plates and patched smaller holes. They couldn't restore the deck to original strength, but they could make it strong enough to launch and recover aircraft. That was the mission. That was all that mattered. Across Honolulu, rolling electrical blackouts dimmed the city as power was redirected to the Navy Yard. The repair crews swarmed Yorktown before the dry dock had fully drained, working in water up to their knees, racing against a clock that measured time in hours, not days. By May 12th, at 1400 hours, 72 hours after entering dry dock, Yorktown's repairs were complete. Not perfect, not pretty, but complete. Admiral Nimitz inspected the work personally. He walked the length of the flight deck, examined the hull patches, reviewed the engineering reports. Then he turned to Captain Buckmaster and asked a simple question. Can she fight? Buckmaster, who knew his ship was being held together by welds and willpower and workers who'd refused to sleep, who knew that by every regulation and standard in the Navy's technical manuals, his carrier should still be in dry dock for another 11 days, gave the only answer that mattered. Yes, sir. What Buckmaster didn't say, what he didn't need to say, because Nimitz could see it in the repair work, in the exhausted faces of the shipyard crews, in the way Yorktown sat in the water with just slightly less grace than before, was that Yorktown was about to sail into the most important naval battle of the Pacific War with repairs that hadn't been tested and systems that hadn't been fully restored. She was going to fight at Midway. And the Japanese, who believed they'd sunk her at Coral Sea, were about to receive an education in resilience that would cost them the war. How did the dead carrier become the ghost that haunted Japan's nightmares? The answer begins with 3 letters every sailor in the Pacific learned to respect. SBD.
Norman Dusty Kleiss was 26 years old from Coffeyville, Kansas, a town so small that everyone knew when you got your pilot's wings before your own family did. He joined the Navy in 1938 because he wanted to fly, and the Navy would teach you to fly for free if you were willing to land on a ship in the middle of the ocean. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Kleiss sat in the cockpit of his Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless dive bomber on Yorktown's flight deck, running through his pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that kept pilots alive. Outside, the sun was climbing over the Pacific, painting the water that particular shade of blue that seemed too beautiful for what was about to happen. Kleiss knew the Japanese carrier fleet was out there, somewhere. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, with their escorts. American intelligence had predicted they'd be here at Midway, attempting to destroy what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and secure Japan's defensive perimeter. What the Japanese didn't know was that the dead Yorktown had arrived. The SBD Dauntless wasn't impressive to look at. Pilots called it slow but deadly because it maxed out at 250 miles per hour, slower than most fighters, slower than many bombers. It carried a crew of 2, pilot up front, radio man gunner in back. Its armament consisted of 2.5 caliber machine guns forward, 2.3 caliber guns aft, and one 1,000-pound bomb slung under the fuselage. But the Dauntless had a feature that made it the most dangerous dive bomber in the Pacific: perforated dive flaps. These weren't complicated. They were sections of reinforced aluminum with hundreds of small holes punched through them, positioned along the trailing edge of the wings. When you deployed them at a dive, they created aerodynamic drag, bleeding off speed, keeping the aircraft stable even in a 70-degree plunge toward the target. This mattered because of physics. At 250 miles per hour in a steep dive without those flaps, an SPD would accelerate past 300, then 350, then beyond the point where control surfaces responded the way they should. The aircraft would buffet, yaw, make accurate bombing impossible. Pilots would release early, miss wide, survive, but accomplish nothing. With the dive flaps, pilots could hold a 70-degree angle, steep enough that you were looking almost straight down at your target, and maintain stable flight all the way to 2,500 feet. At that altitude, with the aircraft stable and the target filling your bomb sight, you could put a 1,000-pound bomb into a circle 30 feet in diameter. The Japanese carriers at Midway had no armor on their flight decks. None. Their designers had chosen speed and aircraft capacity over protection. It was a reasonable trade-off in 1940, when carriers were expected to strike first and avoid being struck at all. But it meant that a 1,000-pound bomb didn't need precision. It needed one hit. One hit would penetrate the wooden flight deck, detonate in the hangar deck below, where aircraft were parked, fueled, armed, and turn the entire ship into an explosion looking for a place to happen. Kleiss and his squadron launched at 8:38 hours. Yorktown's deck crew pushed and pulled the Dauntlesses into position. Engines roared. The deck officer gave the signal, a circular wave with one arm that meant take off or die trying, and one by one the bombers accelerated down the flight deck, dropped slightly as they left the bow, then clawed for altitude. They flew for 2 hours, searching. Finding an enemy fleet in the Pacific was like finding 4 specific grains of sand on a beach the size of Texas. You had radar, but radar only worked to 50 miles. You had scout planes, but scout planes covered maybe 20,000 square miles per sortie. Mostly you had calculations, enemy speed, enemy heading, time since last sighting, weather, luck. At 10:20 hours, Kleiss and his squadron spotted the Japanese fleet. 4 fleet carriers in a rough box formation, screening destroyers. The morning sun reflecting off flight decks that are, at that exact moment, being cleared of aircraft returning from a strike on Midway Island. The Japanese were refueling, rearming, reconfiguring ordnance from land attack bombs to anti-ship torpedoes because their scouts had finally spotted the American fleet. They were caught in the most vulnerable moment of carrier operations. Aircraft on deck, fuel lines connected, ordnance scattered, crews exposed. Kleiss rolled into his dive at 10:24 hours. 70 degrees, dive flaps deployed. The SPD's engine note changed from a roar to a scream as air rushed past at 250 miles per hour. The carrier below, it was Soryu, though Kleiss didn't know that yet, grew larger. Anti-aircraft fire began erupting around him, black puffs of smoke from 25mm guns, tracer rounds from lighter weapons, creating colored streaks in the air. At 2,500 feet, Kleiss centered Soryu in his bomb sight and released. The 1,000-pound bomb fell away. The SPD, suddenly 1,000 pounds lighter, lurched upward. Kleiss pulled back on the stick, pulling 4 Gs, pulling until his vision started to gray at the edges, pulling until the horizon came back into view. He looked back. The bomb hit Soryu just after Istal, penetrated the flight deck, and detonated in the hangar deck below. Within 60 seconds, secondary explosions began rippling through the ship. Fuel ignited, ordnance cooked off, torpedo warheads detonated. The carrier, just moments ago a fighting platform of steel and purpose, became something else entirely. A floating inferno that would burn for hours before capsizing. 711 men aboard Soryu died. Kleiss didn't know that number, couldn't have known it. He was already climbing away, threading through the anti-aircraft fire, heading back to Yorktown. What he did know, what every SBD pilot who attacked that morning knew, was that they had just changed the war.
Everyone focused on the carriers. 4 Japanese fleet carriers versus 3 American. Simple math, simple odds. Nobody noticed the timing. The Japanese had been at sea for 9 days. 9 days of operations, of maintaining combat readiness, of crews working 18-hour days. They were experienced. These were the same carriers that struck Pearl Harbor, but they were tired. Decision-making suffers when you're tired. Reaction time slows. Mistakes happen. The Americans had sailed from Pearl Harbor 2 days earlier. Fresh crews, fresh minds. Yorktown sailors had been in port for repairs, eating real food, sleeping in real bunks. The difference between 9 days at sea and 2 days at sea might not sound like much, but it compounds. It compounds in the deck crew that connects fuel lines just slightly slower because their hands are shaking from exhaustion. It compounds in the radar operator who misidentifies in incoming contact because his eyes have been staring at a green screen for 6 hours. It compounds in the commander who makes the decision about ordnance changes, bombs for torpedoes, torpedoes for bombs, based on incomplete information and insufficient time to think through the consequences. At 10:24, when Kleiss and his squadron rolled into their dives, the Japanese carriers were caught in that exact moment of vulnerability. Crews were in the middle of switching ordnance configurations. Fuel lines were connected. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered on the hangar decks. Fire suppression systems were rated for normal operations, not for multiple simultaneous ordnance explosions. This wasn't bad luck. This was the accumulated consequence of 9 days of operations, creating a 30-minute window where everything went wrong at once. And 3 American carrier air groups from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown all arrived in that 30-minute window. The difference wasn't just timing. It was training. American dive bomber pilots trained differently than their Japanese counterparts. Japanese pilots practiced high-altitude level bombing and shallow dives, tactics designed to attack warships with heavy armor. American pilots, training against the possibility of attacking carriers with minimal deck armor, practiced the steep 70-degree dives that the SBD's perforated flaps made possible. Steep dives meant less time exposed to anti-aircraft fire. Less time meant higher survival rates. Higher survival rates meant more experienced pilots staying alive to train the next generation. It was a feedback loop that wouldn't become apparent until Midway, when the difference between a 45-degree dive and a 70-degree dive meant the difference between missing and hitting. The Japanese had been winning for 6 months. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, an unbroken string of victories that created a dangerous assumption
that Japanese training and Japanese tactics were superior. They weren't superior. They were optimized for a different kind of war. The Japanese Navy had trained to fight the decisive battle, one massive fleet engagement that would destroy the enemy's will to continue fighting. Every tactic, every weapon, every operational plan pointed toward that single moment. The American Navy, forced onto the defensive after Pearl Harbor, trained to survive, to take hits and keep fighting, to repair damage that other navies would consider fatal, to fight outnumbered and win anyway. Yorktown embodied that philosophy. Damaged at Coral Sea, repaired in 72 hours, back in the fight 3 weeks later. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Japanese damage control doctrine assumed that major damage meant withdrawal for extended repairs. American doctrine assumed that major damage meant you fixed what you could and kept fighting. That difference between withdrawing and persisting was about to become devastatingly clear.
At 13:29 hours on June 4th, Yorktown's radar picked up incoming aircraft, 33 miles out, closing fast. The Japanese had found her. Captain Buckmaster ordered the deck cleared immediately. Every aircraft that could fly was launched, including fighters that had been on deck for refueling, some with barely enough fuel for 15 minutes of combat time. The pilots didn't hesitate. 15 minutes would have to be enough. The last 2 fighters were physically pushed off the flight deck as the Japanese attack formation came into visual range. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, leading Yorktown's fighter squadron VF-3, intercepted the attackers at 15 miles. His Wildcats tore into the formation, disrupting the carefully coordinated attack pattern. The Japanese had planned to come in organized, dive bombers from high altitude, torpedo bombers from low, overwhelming the defenses. Thatch's aggressive intercept broke that organization. Japanese formations scattered. Pilots had to choose between maintaining position and defending themselves. Most chose survival. It wasn't enough to stop all of them. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers from the carrier Hiryu, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. They launched with one mission: find and destroy the American carriers. Kobayashi, flying plane BII-201 with gunner Warrant Officer Yoshinori, pressed his attack even as American fighters shredded his formation. 3 Vals penetrated the defensive screen. They rolled into their dives simultaneously, a coordinated attack that gave Yorktown's anti-aircraft gunners 3 targets at once, which meant they couldn't concentrate fire. The first bomb hit Yorktown's flight deck at 1340, penetrated 3 decks, and exploded in the forward engine room. The blast killed or wounded every man in the compartment and started fires that spread through ventilation systems. The second bomb hit 17 seconds later, punching through the flight deck and detonating in the rag storage room, the same location that had been damaged at Coral Sea. The repair work, those welds and plates that Boyd Mackenzie and his crew had completed 72 hours before, held for approximately 40 seconds before the heat caused critical structural failure. The third bomb hit the island's superstructure, destroying the radar installation and killing the crew manning it. 3 hits, 300 seconds from first impact to damage assessment complete. Yorktown's boiler fires were out. All power lost. The ship went dead in the water, listing 5 degrees to port. Of the 24 Japanese aircraft that attacked, only 6 returned to Hiryu. 18 were shot down, a catastrophic loss rate that testified to the ferocity of American fighter defense. Of the 6 that made it back, only 2 were undamaged. Kobayashi's aircraft was among those lost. Captain Buckmaster, standing on the bridge, watched his ship dying for the second time in a month and made the same decision he had made at Coral Sea:
"Save the crew," he ordered. But Commander Aldridge, the damage control officer who'd kept Yorktown alive at Coral Sea, wasn't ready to give up. "Captain," he said, "request permission to try." Buckmaster looked at him, looked at the smoke pouring from below-deck spaces, looked at the list that was slowly increasing. Every instinct said the ship was finished. "How long?" Buckmaster asked. "Give me 30 minutes." Buckmaster gave him 20. Aldridge and his damage control teams went below, into smoke-filled compartments where visibility measured in inches, into spaces where temperatures reached 150 degrees. They fought fires with portable extinguishers. They shored up bulkheads with timber. They isolated damaged sections. They manually operated valves that were supposed to be controlled electronically. They got power back. 1 boiler, 1 turbine, enough for 5 knots of speed. Then 10 knots, then 15. At 14:10 hours, exactly 30 minutes after the attack began, Yorktown was making 16 knots and recovering aircraft. The fighters that had launched with minimal fuel reserves were running on fumes. They trapped aboard a carrier that, by all reasonable expectations, should have been sinking. Japanese pilots climbing away from the attack reported Yorktown sunk for the second time. For the second time, they were wrong. By 14:30 hours, Yorktown was making 20 knots. Her flight deck was operational. She was recovering aircraft and preparing to launch strike groups. She looked hurt. Smoke still poured from below-deck spaces. Her list was noticeable. Her speed was reduced, but she was fighting. The Japanese weren't finished with her. At 1600 hours, Yorktown's radar, hastily repaired after the first attack, detected another incoming strike. Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, the same aircraft that had devastated Pearl Harbor. 10 aircraft flying low over the water, carrying Type 91 torpedoes, each one packing 450 pounds of high explosive in a warhead designed to crack a battleship's hull. Yorktown had minutes to respond. Her fighter screen was depleted. Most of her Wildcats were either recovering from the previous engagement or low on fuel and ammunition. The few fighters that could intercept did, attacking the torpedo bombers aggressively, shooting down several, forcing others to release early. But 6 torpedo bombers pressed their attacks. They came from different angles, coordinating their approach so that no matter which way Yorktown turned, she'd expose her broadside to someone. Captain Buckmaster ordered hard turns, trying to present the smallest target profile. Yorktown heeled over, turning so sharply that sailors on deck had to grab stanchions to avoid sliding overboard. It wasn't enough. At 16:20 hours, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side. They hit within seconds of each other, below the waterline, in the engineering spaces that Commander Aldridge and his teams had just restored to operation. The explosions were different from bombs. Torpedoes don't just pierce and explode. They create hydrostatic shock, a pressure wave that travels through water faster than it travels through air, crushing everything it touches. Frames buckled, seams opened. Flooding was immediate and uncontrollable. Lieutenant Commander Delaney, the chief engineer, tried everything. Emergency pumps, counterflooding to correct the list, shoring up bulkheads. Nothing worked. At 16:35 hours, he reported to Captain Buckmaster, "All boiler fires are out. All power is lost. It is impossible to correct the list." Yorktown rolled to 26 degrees, the angle where capsize becomes inevitable. Buckmaster, for the second time that day, gave the order to abandon ship. This time, the damage control teams couldn't save her. Sailors went over the side, sliding down lines into the Pacific. Destroyers moved in close, plucking men from the water. The sea temperature was 76 degrees, warm enough that hypothermia wasn't an immediate threat, but exposure would kill eventually. By 500 hours, Yorktown was drifting, abandoned, listing 26 degrees to port, down by the bow. Japanese pilots returning to their carriers reported Yorktown sunk for the 3rd time. For the 3rd time, they were almost right.
Yorktown didn't sink immediately. She should have, by every principle of naval architecture. A carrier with that much flooding and that severe a list should capsize within hours. But Yorktown had something most carriers didn't: a damage control philosophy built into her design from the keel up. When Yorktown was commissioned in 1937, American naval designers had learned lessons from World War I. They'd studied battle damage reports, they'd analyzed how ships died, and they'd reached a conclusion that would define American carrier construction: compartmentalization. Yorktown wasn't a single ship. She was hundreds of individual compartments, each one sealed off from its neighbors by watertight doors and bulkheads. When flooding occurred, you isolated the damaged compartments and preserved the rest. When fires broke out, you sealed the affected sections and prevented spread. This approach had a cost: internal complexity. More hatches, more doors, more systems to maintain. Japanese carriers, designed for speed and aircraft capacity, simplified their internal layouts. Fewer compartments meant more efficient use of space, faster movement of personnel, easier maintenance. It also meant that damage propagated faster. At Midway, when American bombs penetrated Japanese carrier decks and detonated in hangar spaces filled with fueled and armed aircraft, the explosion spread. Fire consumed entire deck levels. Fuel flowed through ventilation systems. Ordnance cooked off and detonated. The carriers burned from the inside out. Yorktown's compartmentalization meant that even with catastrophic damage, large sections of the ship remained intact, sealed off, survivable. Which is why on the evening of June 4th, 1942, Yorktown was still afloat. By June 5th, American commanders faced a decision: abandon Yorktown completely or attempt salvage. Salvage operations were dangerous. The ship was a hulk, drifting down by the bow with a 26-degree list. Japanese submarines were known to be operating in the area. A salvage attempt would require ships, tugs, crews, resources that the Navy couldn't afford to lose if the operation failed. But Yorktown was a fleet carrier, one of only 3 remaining in the Pacific. If she could be saved, if she could be towed back to Pearl Harbor, repaired properly this time, returned to service, she was worth the risk. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American task force, authorized the salvage attempt. On the morning of June 6th, the fleet tug USS Yorktown approached Yorktown and passed a towing cable. Destroyer USS Hammond came alongside to provide electrical power, fire suppression, and pumping capacity. A salvage crew of 170 men, volunteers who knew they were boarding a ship that might sink at any moment, went aboard. For the next 24 hours, they fought to save her. They ran portable pumps to control flooding. They worked in compartments tilted at angles that made standing impossible. They braced damaged bulkheads with timber. They welded patches over hull breaches. They worked through the night, lit by portable lamps, breathing air thick with oil fumes and smoke. By the morning of June 7th, Yorktown's list had been reduced to 22 degrees, not stable, but improving. Yorktown was making 3 knots, towing Yorktown toward Pearl Harbor. If they could maintain this pace for 7 days, they'd make it. They had hours.
Lieutenant A.C. Emerson was a salvage specialist, trained in damage control and emergency ship handling. He'd volunteered for the salvage crew specifically because he'd served aboard Yorktown before and knew her layout better than most. On June 7th, he was working in a flooded compartment 3 decks below the waterline. attempting to shore up a bulkhead that was holding back approximately 400 tons of seawater. The compartment was pitch black, except for his portable lamp. The water was at chest height, cold despite the tropical climate, contaminated with fuel oil that made every surface slippery. The bulkhead, a steel wall designed to withstand normal loads, was bowing inward, groaning with stress. Emerson and his team braced it with timbers cut to exact length, wedging them between the bulkhead and the opposite wall. It was temporary. It was crude. It would hold long enough for the pumps to lower the water level, or it would fail catastrophically and flood 4 additional compartments. "If this goes," Emerson said to his crew, "we swim fast." Nobody laughed. At 1300 hours, the bulkhead held. The pumps lowered the water level by 6 inches. It was progress, small, incremental, earned through hours of work in conditions that would have justified abandonment. Emerson's crew stayed. Among the volunteers was Donald Wilson, an electrician's mate who'd been working on Yorktown since the Pearl Harbor repairs. Wilson had spent those 72 hours in May tracing damaged circuits and jury-rigging connections. Now he was back, fighting to save the ship again. Aboard USS Hammond, tied alongside Yorktown, Ensign Robert Wood commanded a damage control team working to restore electrical power to critical systems. Hammond was providing power through cables, but the connections were temporary and unreliable. If they could restore even one of Yorktown's generators, they could reduce the load on Hammond and make the towing operation more stable. Wood's team traced electrical circuits through damaged cable runs, bypassing sections that had been destroyed by fire or flooding. They jury-rigged connections that would make an electrical engineer file a formal complaint. They got lights working in critical spaces, got pumps running at higher capacity, got ventilation systems clearing smoke. By 1330 hours on June 7th, they were making real progress. That's when the torpedoes hit.
Commander Yahachi Tanabe, commanding the Japanese submarine I-168, had been stalking Yorktown since the afternoon of June 6th. He'd received orders to locate and destroy any damaged American carriers attempting to escape the Midway battle area. His submarine carried 20 torpedoes and a crew trained to use them. Finding Yorktown hadn't been difficult. A carrier under tow, listing 22 degrees, trailing oil, moving at 3 knots, this was a target that couldn't maneuver and couldn't hide. The difficult part was getting into firing position. Yorktown was surrounded by destroyers conducting anti-submarine patrols. Their sonar was active, their depth charges were ready. Any submarine approaching on the surface would be spotted immediately. Any submarine approaching submerged would be detected by sonar. Tanabe chose a middle path. Approach submerged to periscope depth, close to within torpedo range, fire a full spread, and dive deep immediately. At 1330 on June 7th, I-168 reached firing position, 1,200 yards from Yorktown's port side. Tanabe, looking through his periscope, could see the salvage operation clearly. The tug Vireo straining at her towing cable, Hammond tied alongside, her generators running, crew visible on deck. Men working on Yorktown's hull, attempting the impossible. He felt what professional warriors feel when facing worthy opponents: respect. Years later, in his 1963 article for the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, titled "I Sank the Yorktown at Midway," Tanabe would describe this moment. Watching American sailors fighting to save their ship, knowing what he was about to do, understanding that this was simply the nature of war. he ordered a 4-torpedo spread. At 13:36, I-168 fired. 4 Type 95 torpedoes, each carrying 890 pounds of explosive, left the submarine's tubes with the distinctive compressed air hiss that submariners learn to recognize even through a steel hull. They ran at 48 knots, leaving bubble trails visible from above, converging on Yorktown and Hammond. Donald Wilson, working on Yorktown's deck, was one of the first to see them coming. The white wakes against the blue Pacific. 4 parallel lines, arrows straight, closing fast. "Torpedoes in the larder, port side!" Hammond's captain ordered emergency maneuvering, but destroyers tied alongside carriers don't maneuver. They're fixed in position by mooring lines and power cables, and the physics of 2,000-ton vessels pressed against each other. The first torpedo struck Hammond amidships at 13:38. The explosion broke her keel, a catastrophic structural failure that no damage control system could address. The destroyer began sinking immediately, bow and stern rising as the middle section collapsed into the water. Men abandoned ship. Some jumped, some slid down lines, some were thrown overboard by the explosion. They had seconds. Hammond sank in 4 minutes, taking 81 men with her. The second torpedo struck Yorktown. One hit forward port side in the engineering spaces already damaged by the previous day's attack. The other hit amidships, punching through the hull in a section that had remained watertight until that moment. 2 torpedo hits wouldn't have been immediately fatal to a healthy carrier, but Yorktown wasn't healthy. It was wounded, listing, barely afloat, held together by temporary repairs and salvage crew determination. The new damage overwhelmed systems that were already at their limits. Flooding accelerated. The list increased to 24 degrees, then 26, then 28. Counterflooding wasn't possible. There was no power for pumps. Shoring up bulkheads wasn't possible. The bulkheads themselves were compromised. Lieutenant Emerson, still working below decks when the torpedoes hit, felt the impact through the ship's frame, that distinctive double thump of underwater explosions transmitting through steel. The water level in his compartment rose 6 inches in 10 seconds, then 12 inches. Then the lights went out. "Up!" he shouted to his crew. "Everybody up now!" They climbed, through flooded compartments, through passages tilted at angles that required climbing more than walking, through hatches that had to be muscled open because the list had jammed them in their frames. Behind them, the ocean poured into Yorktown's lower decks, filling spaces that had been dry, collapsing bulkheads that had been holding. The salvage crew abandoned ship at 1400. Every man made it off. They'd spent 36 hours saving Yorktown, and now they were swimming away from her for the second time in 3 days. USS Yorktown cut the towing cable. Destroyers moved in to collect survivors. By 1415, all American vessels were clear. Yorktown drifted, alone, listing 30 degrees to port, down by the bow, settling slowly into the Pacific. Commander Tanabe, watching through his periscope, transmitted his report. Large carrier, Yorktown class, torpedoed and sinking. Destroyer escort sunk. I-168 departing area. This time, the assessment was correct, but Yorktown still refused to die quickly.
Through the afternoon and evening of June 7th, Yorktown drifted. Her list increased gradually, 30 degrees, 32 degrees, 34 degrees. Water flooded compartments that had been sealed, found pathways through damaged bulkheads, spread throughout the ship. The carrier settled lower, her flight deck edge approaching the waterline. American destroyers maintained watch from a distance. They couldn't approach. Japanese submarines were still in the area, but they couldn't leave either. Yorktown was still a commissioned U.S. Navy vessel. She deserved witnesses. At dawn on June 7th, she was still afloat, listing 36 degrees, her island superstructure nearly touching the water. The morning sun reflected off her hull, the same sun that had reflected off Pearl Harbor 5 months earlier, off Coral Sea 4 weeks earlier, off Midway 3 days earlier. Men aboard the watching destroyers placed bets on when she'd finally capsize. Some said hours, some said minutes. Nobody said days, because ships don't survive this kind of damage for days. But Yorktown's designers, 5 years earlier, had built redundancy into her design. Multiple watertight compartments, subdivided fuel tanks, isolated damage control systems. Even with massive flooding, even with electrical power gone and pumps silent and crew absent, the compartmentalization kept her afloat. At 5 a.m. hours on June 7, 1942, Yorktown rolled to 40 degrees. Her flight deck touched the water. The starboard side of her hull rose into the air, exposing the massive bronze propellers that had driven her at 32 knots when she was whole. At 7:01 hours, she capsized completely, rolling onto her port side. At 7:01 hours, she sank. 3 miles of ocean, 16,600 feet of dark water swallowed her in less than a minute. The destroyers marked her position. Officers recorded the time. Sailors removed their covers and stood at attention as their carrier disappeared beneath the Pacific. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, aboard one of the rescue vessels, watched his ship die. He'd commanded her for 16 months, fought her through 2 major battles, watched her get hit 7 times by bombs and torpedoes, watched her crew refuse to let her die, watched her survive damage that should have killed her 3 times over. He would later write in his action report, "USS Yorktown fought as long as she had men aboard to fight her. When the crew could no longer save her, she fought alone, remaining afloat for 36 hours after abandonment, defying enemy reports of her sinking, refusing to surrender even when she had no power, no crew, and no hope of survival. She was, to the last, a fighting ship." Yorktown took 19,800 tons of steel, 2,000 sailors' worth of training and experience, and the combat power of 72 aircraft to the bottom. But she'd done something that no tonnage measurement could quantify. She'd bought time. Time for Enterprise and Hornet to launch their strikes. Time for American dive bombers to find Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Time for the U.S. Navy to sink 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in a single day. Time for the tide of the Pacific War to turn. 3 Japanese carrier strikes had hit Yorktown. She'd absorbed 7 bombs and 4 torpedoes. She'd drawn fire that would have otherwise targeted Enterprise and Hornet. By refusing to die, by fighting back, by recovering aircraft, by staying operational even when crippled, she'd forced the Japanese to dedicate resources to killing her instead of killing her sister carriers. In naval warfare, this is called a fleet in being, a ship that exerts influence through its mere existence, forcing the enemy to account for it, to plan around it, to dedicate forces to neutralizing it. Yorktown had been a fleet in being even as she was dying. The Japanese sank her, but in doing so, they'd lost the Battle of Midway. They'd lost 4 carriers. They'd lost 3,057 men. They'd lost the initiative in the Pacific, and they would never regain it. Yorktown sank, but Japan's carrier fleet sank with her.
The numbers from Midway tell a story that historians are still analyzing 80 years later. 4 Japanese carriers sunk: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Combined displacement, 109,000 tons. Combined aircraft complement, 256 planes. Combined crew, over 4,800 sailors and airmen. Of those, 2,181 died in the battle or during the sinking of their ships. Japan lost 37% of its carrier pilot strength in one day. These weren't recruits. These were the veterans who'd struck Pearl Harbor, who'd ranged across the Pacific for 6 months, who represented thousands of hours of training and combat experience. Replacing carriers takes years. Replacing trained pilots takes longer. One carrier sunk, Yorktown. Displacement, 19,800 tons. Aircraft complement, 72 planes. Crew casualties, 141 killed during the battle, 81 more killed aboard Hammond during the salvage operation. Total, 222 men. These numbers represented sons, husbands, fathers, men with names and hometowns, and families who would receive telegrams beginning with, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you." But the strategic equation was brutally clear. Japan had traded 4 carriers for 1, 4 trained air groups for 1. Any military commander would call that a catastrophic exchange ratio. The Japanese advance into the Pacific stopped at Midway. Plans to invade New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were canceled. The defensive perimeter that Japan had spent 6 months establishing became a boundary they would spend the next 3 years defending, then losing, then abandoning. Yorktown's sacrifice, and it was a sacrifice because carriers don't survive 7 bomb and torpedo hits by accident, had purchased something priceless: initiative. After Midway, the Japanese Navy fought defensively. After Midway, the U.S. Navy had the luxury of choosing when and where to fight. After Midway, the outcome of the Pacific War became a question of when, not if. One carrier, one 72-hour repair job, one crew that refused to accept that their ship was finished.
In the decades following the war, Japanese naval officers who'd fought at Midway reflected on what they'd witnessed. The speed of American repairs, the resilience of American damage control, the determination of American crews who refused to accept defeat. These reflections weren't about tactics or strategy alone. They were about a fundamental difference in naval philosophy. The Japanese Navy had been designed to win the decisive battle, while the American Navy had been designed to survive and keep fighting. When Yorktown appeared at Midway, a carrier that Japanese intelligence had confirmed sunk at Coral Sea, it shattered Japanese assumptions about American capabilities. If their intelligence was wrong about this, what else were they wrong about? If American carriers could be repaired in 72 hours instead of weeks, how could Japan win a war of attrition? Commander Tanabe
who delivered the fatal torpedoes to Yorktown, understood what it meant. In his 1963 article, he wrote about watching the salvage operation through his periscope, about seeing American sailors working to save their ship even after it had been abandoned once already. He knew, even as he gave the firing order, that this kind of determination, this refusal to accept the impossible, was something Japan couldn't match through military force alone. The American advantage wasn't just industrial capacity or technological superiority. It was cultural, a willingness to attempt repairs that other navies would consider impossible, to fight with damaged ships that other navies would scuttle, to return to battle before healing was complete because the mission demanded it. Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered Yorktown's wreck in 1998, noted in his expedition report, "We found her sitting upright in 16,600 feet of water, remarkably preserved. Her anti-aircraft guns were still pointing upward, frozen in their final positions. It was as if the ship was still fighting, still refusing to accept that the battle was over." In 2023, the Ocean Exploration Trust vessel Dauntless spent 43 hours documenting Yorktown's wreck. Chief Scientist Daniel Wagner reported, "During over 43 hours at depth, we methodically circumnavigated these historic wrecks, bringing to light many features in great detail, including their armament, battle, and sinking-related damage. Many anti-aircraft guns were still pointing upward, providing clues about the final moments on these iconic ships. Those guns, still pointing upward after 80 years on the ocean floor, tell the story better than any historian could. Yorktown never stopped fighting."
May 12, 1942. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, Dry Dock Number 1. That carpenter, Boyd Mackenzie, finishing his welding work, looking at the patched hull of a carrier that everyone said couldn't be repaired in time, couldn't have known she had 23 days left. He couldn't have known that his 72 hours of continuous work, his decision to weld massive plates over damaged frames instead of replacing them, his acceptance of good enough instead of perfect, would put Yorktown in position to change history. Mackenzie returned to civilian life after the war, continuing his trade in shipyards along the East Coast. He rarely spoke about those 3 days in May 1942. When he did, he focused not on his own work, but on the 1,400 men who'd worked alongside him, electricians, welders, machinists, all refusing to accept that 3 weeks of work couldn't be compressed into 3 days. Captain Elliot Buckmaster survived the war. He retired as a vice admiral in 1947, having commanded multiple vessels and trained thousands of officers. In his retirement, he rarely spoke about Yorktown publicly. When he did, he focused not on the battles, but on the crew, the men who fought fires, who manned guns, who refused to abandon ship even when abandonment was the logical choice. He died on October 10, 1976. Among his personal effects was a photograph of Yorktown taken at Pearl Harbor on May 12, 1942, the day she left dry dock to sail for Midway. The photograph showed the repair work, the hull patches, the welded seams, the hasty fixes that were visible even from a distance. On the back of the photograph, in Buckmaster's handwriting, was a single sentence. "They told us it couldn't be done in time. The shipyard workers didn't believe them." The men of Yorktown, both the crew who fought her and the workers who saved her, taught the U.S. Navy a lesson that became doctrine. It's still taught at the Naval Academy today. Ships don't die when their hulls break
or their engines fail. Ships die when their crews stop believing they can be saved. Yorktown's crew never stopped believing. The shipyard workers never stopped believing. Even when the naval inspector said 2 weeks minimum, even when damage control manuals said catastrophic failure, even when Japanese pilots reported her sunk 3 times, someone, somewhere, refused to accept it. That refusal to accept the impossible became America's maritime philosophy for the rest of the war. It's why the Navy developed the damage control training programs that saved hundreds of ships in subsequent battles. It's why the American carriers survived kamikaze hits that should have been fatal. It's why the Essex-class carriers, Yorktown's successors, were designed with even more sophisticated compartmentalization and damage control systems. The Navy named another carrier Yorktown, CV-10, Essex-class, commissioned in April 1943. She fought through the rest of the Pacific War, survived multiple attacks, earned 11 battle stars, and was finally decommissioned in 1970. She's now a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina, maintained by volunteers who understand that preserving her preserves the memory of CV-5. CV-5, the original Yorktown, rests 3 miles below the surface, in darkness so complete that light cannot reach her. At that depth, the pressure is over 7,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush an unprotected human body instantly. The water temperature is just above freezing. Nothing grows there. Nothing lives there except for deep-sea organisms that have never seen the sun. But Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns still point upward. Still trained on an enemy that stopped coming 80 years ago. Still fighting a battle that ended when the last sailor climbed on a rope into the Pacific and watched his ship roll over and sink.
Lieutenant A.C. Emerson, the salvage specialist who'd worked below decks until the torpedoes hit, survived this sinking. He served on other vessels, participated in other battles, retired in 1959. In his personal papers, donated to the Naval Historical Foundation after his death, there's a single-page account of his final moments aboard Yorktown. He described climbing out of the flooded compartment. He described the sound of water rushing through passages that should have been sealed. He described reaching the flight deck and seeing the 30-degree list and knowing finally that Yorktown was finished. And he described looking back at the ship as the destroyer pulled away, watching her settle into the water, and thinking a single thought: she deserved better. Perhaps she did. Perhaps every ship that fights deserves to survive. Perhaps every sailor who refuses to give up deserves to win. But Yorktown got something that might matter more than survival. She got to change the war. She got 72 hours in dry dock instead of 2 weeks. She got 3 weeks of combat instead of months in repair. She got to fight at Midway when Japan expected 3 American carriers and found 4. She got to absorb attacks meant for Enterprise and Hornet. She got to prove that American carriers could survive, could fight back, could refuse to die even when death was inevitable. She got to matter. 16,600 feet below the Pacific, USS Yorktown CV-5 rests with her crew. Those who stayed with the ship, who died in explosions or fires or compartments that flooded before they could escape. Still fighting. Still refusing to yield. Still teaching us 80 years later that resilience isn't about never taking damage. It's about refusing to stay down when you do.